Hello and welcome to this edition of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. Today we're really lucky to have Dr. Joe Shingler, who's a principal forensic psychologist for STRIVE, which is Support, Treatment, Risk Management, Identity, Values and Enabling Service. That's your title. And Jenny Stickney, who is an advanced occupational therapist practitioner in STRIVE, in Dorset, and a consultant OT in the HMPPS Enable team. So welcome to you both. We're really pleased to have you both here. So we just wondered if you tell us a bit about how you got into your roles to begin with. Maybe we could start with you, Joe.
Yeah, sure. So it's very hard to know where to start, really, because I certainly didn't come into forensic psychology knowingly with any sort of plan. I left university deciding to I wanted to work for a period of time, didn't want to carry on studying. And interestingly, I ended up in a secure psychiatric hospital as an occupational therapy assistant. That was my first job. It just looked interesting and somehow managed to convince them to give me the job. So I found that work really interesting, but it became very apparent to me quite quickly that occupational therapy was not for me. I wasn't cut out for that. It wasn't my natural home. And whilst I really liked my occupational therapy colleagues, I quickly realised that that wasn't the sort of thing that was going to speak to me. So I transferred quite quickly to the psychology department and became a psychology assistant. And then from there, really, all of my assistant psychologist colleagues were applying for clinical training and forensic training. So I just sort of did it because that's what everybody else was doing, and found myself with a forensic psychology training place before a clinical psychology training place. So just went with it, really. Found myself at Dartmoor Prison and Channingswood Prison in the early 90s, and sort of went from there. So it certainly wasn't a planned trajectory. It was like a series of decisions that just led me down that path. But once I was in it, I realized that that's certainly the thing I wanted to do, and haven't ever really looked back. So it was definitely the right choice, but I wouldn't say it was a planned trajectory.
And then how about you, Jenny? How did you get into your role?
My plan was a little bit more planned than Joe's, that I knew that I wanted to do occupational therapy at university, so I took an opportunity to do some volunteering work before applying to get onto the course, and I was volunteering at a local mental health hospital, and I was given this opportunity to work within the local day hospital there, which was really designed around supporting individuals who'd been in a hospital long term, supporting their gradual resettlement, reintegration back into the community. And those individuals tended to be the more sort of institutionalized individuals who'd been in hospital a long time, and often many of them had forensic backgrounds, so they were coming from secure services. And I really enjoyed that long-term working with them. I really felt very, very strongly about their experiences that they'd had, and looked at the difficulties they had with skill development and the skill deficits they had to support their journey back out into the community. So when I went on to study at university, I really knew I wanted to work within mental health. And so whilst occupational therapy is probably more traditionally known within physical settings, and that's where people tend to go to when they think about occupational therapists. I think OTs within mental health is an expanding area, and even more so is looking at OTs within prisons and secure services. That whilst that has been a very small group of OTs when I first qualified back in the mid 1990s, now it's much more common to find OTs in these positions. So I qualified and I graduated from university, and I got a job up in one of the high secure hospitals in the north of England, and that's where my sort of career has taken me. I've been very fortunate enough to work not only in this country but in South Africa and New Zealand in different challenging behaviour centres for young people, and forensic services prisons in New Zealand, and then came back to this country and carried on that route within more mental health services, and then gradually over my career have worked more and more within prisons and more community settings, to find myself in an amazing position now where I work part-time within STRIVE in a clinical role, supporting and managing an occupational therapy service, but also within HMPPS as an OT consultant, looking at regime design and delivery, reframing the national regime across the prison service. So it's really bringing to light the value occupational therapy brings within this sort of area of work, which hasn't necessarily been recognised up until relatively recently.
Well, that's fascinating. One of the things we often get asked is how can you get into forensic psychology? So it's interesting that you had a occupational therapist assistant. So the more creative ways we can find people to sort of get their roots in, and also how aligned the two sort of services are.
Yeah, I think one of the things I advise or suggest to people sometimes is, I think before I got my OT assistant job, I spent quite a lot of summers, and these were the days, well, many years ago, when sort of casual was easy to come by. I worked in job centres, frequently signing people on who were homeless and who were marginalised and who had to come in personally to collect their money from the job centre, and they were a group of people that nobody else in the job centre really wanted to interact with. So I often found myself on the inquiries desk dealing with this really challenging group of people who often came in drunk or under the influence of drugs, but often quite angry because, you know, their money was late or whatever. And I guess it just made me think about how we treat people and what I needed to do to get people on side, and how I needed to, even as quite a young person, really thinking about how, you know, because actually people were generally just desperate, and that would often come out as anger and frustration. But I found that if you just talk to people a bit and you're kind to them and you're pleasant to them, then actually lots of that often melts away in that setting. So I guess even before my first proper employed job, I guess I just found myself working with a marginalised group who were really struggling to fit themselves into society. And I think that it opened my eyes really to different ways in which you can work with people, and you know how you can engage people, I guess. And I guess it took me a few years to really realize that had been sort of fundamental in my pathway, but I think it probably was, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. And thinking about those transferable skills as well that people have and they naturally gain in a different place, but they applying them and sort of recognizing that those really valuable skills they might already have.
Yeah.
So could you tell us, Jenny, a bit about the IIRMS service and what you offer in the IIRMS service?
Yes, so IIRMS stands for Intensive Intervention and Risk Management Service. So it's part of the offender personality disorder pathway. It's a community aspect. So the offender personality disorder pathway is a whole systems approach. It sees people through their custodial journey and out into resettling into the community. So the IIRMS is that resettlement part of the pathway. And Joe and I both work in Dorset, so our service is called Strive. Every IIRMS is given a different name, but it's a national project where every county really has an IIRMS service to support individuals who are screened into the offender personality disorder pathway. That doesn't mean to say that they have to have a diagnosis of personality disorder. It is just individuals who show traits or have been screened into the personality disorder pathway during their time in prison, and this is a service that's offered to them to recognise some of the challenges that they experienced as a result of usually significant trauma in childhood and relational difficulties that they experience that contribute towards some of the challenges they behave and getting stuck in prison, and often serving long custodial sentences, and they're deemed as high risk. So there's certain criteria within the OPD screening aspect that they have to screen into, and we start working with them. So the IIRMS aspect tends to start working with individuals ideally at least 6 months prior to release, and we see people out of prison resettle into the community, and we have our particular service has no limit of time. So we work with individuals who are 18 years and over. We don't have a top age limit, and we don't have a cap on how long we work with them, and we can work with people for many years, and sometimes that's people coming out of prison and going back into prison and come out of prison again, just to to form that relationship with them, to show that we're on that journey with them. And it's really working sort of in a trauma-informed model, using relationships as the core of what we do, and ensuring that we sort of work with within the, sort of the attachment model as well, to secure those attachments with individuals that often haven't had positive attachments or positive role models in their lives. And I suppose that's one of the most important things that we recognise in our service, the people that we work with talk about, is that that longevity of working has meant so much that we never give up hope, that if they want to work with us, because it's a voluntary service, we'll support them in their journey based on their goals, their values, and what they want to achieve by working with us.
I think our individual approach to our work with people is really important. So everybody in our service gets a slightly different thing depending on what they need. So some people have psychological therapy. We do schema therapy, for example. Some people want psychological time, but it isn't sort of formal therapy. So it might be sort of reflective discussions, it might be emotional coping work, it might be skills work. Some people will get psychology and occupational therapy if that's what they really need. Some people will get one or the other. Some people, the priority is clearly one or the other, and the other one's a bit more light touch. And I just think, again, that makes for a really effective service. It is so individual, that everybody gets what everybody gets looks slightly different. And I think the other thing that we do that I think is really beneficial is the ongoing contact with people post-recall. So if somebody's recalled, we make contact very, very quickly with them, and we maintain support. If they want to continue working with our service, we continue to work with them. And that feels like a really important thing that we do, because I think, the research into recall, though it's pretty limited, is also pretty clear that people feel very forgotten about. They feel very hopeless. They feel very abandoned when they're recalled. And I think we have been able to make a difference to people by maintaining that contact, maintaining a relationship, visiting them in prison if need be, maintaining contact by phone or letter or email. I think that post-recall service that we provide, and see people out to get into the community, help them plan again, I think that has been that's a significantly important bit of our service, I think.
Picking up on that point about, I guess, people transitioning from prison to the community, or perhaps back from the community to prison, I guess in your experience, Joe and Jenny, what have been the kind of key factors that have enabled people to successfully transition?
A trusting, meaningful professional relationship, I think they're really important. And having a release plan that is built on a knowledge and understanding of the person and their unique circumstances. I think that's really important. I think pace of a release plan is really important. So we've found that people very quickly feel overwhelmed by their experience in the community, even people who are very well prepared in prison, and have done lots of treatment programs and who've engaged in all sorts of services. Often the experience of being in the community is emotionally overwhelming for people. So taking things at a pace where they can just learn to adjust and to be in the community. And there's often like this urge to get everything done very, very quickly and make up for lost time, and there's sort of a rush to achieve things, and that is often something that really trips people up. So that's the opposite. What often sort of contributes to failure is this sort of rush to get everything done at once. So helping people to calm down, slow down, and really take things a step at a time feels really important. And good team working, so good connections with prison staff, good connections with the probation service in the community, so working alongside people really well, good connections with the hostels, working with the hostel staff to support people, listening to what individual people want and how they want their release plan to look, and how we can help them to start to step into a life that has some meaning and some purpose. Those things are all really important.
We're formulation focused, so we ensure that we know why people might be behaving in certain ways, that helps us work with them, but also helps communicate why we're working in the way that we do. I think we realise that that's so important, because sometimes when we don't have a full picture about the individual's past, and we sometimes can get tripped up and we can get carried away in working in perhaps not always the most helpful ways, or ways that we sometimes sort of in hindsight would think, oh, maybe I wouldn't have done that if I knew that part of the story. So I think the formulation focus is really, really important. I think holding hope for individuals is absolutely essential. We work with individuals that come have got very complex, difficult pasts, and they have really, really positive times, but they also have very difficult times, and holding hope during those difficult times, as Jo mentioned, like recall, but even sort of just having difficulties in the community, interpersonal relationship difficulties, is often a really, really significant thing for individuals, and holding hope with them, that we often hold that for them and say that when they're ready to take it, we'll give it, that they can take it back, but we'll hold it whilst they're struggling. Some meaningful use of time, sort of them feeling as though that they get up to contribute towards either themselves progressing or others progressing or supporting the community, something meaningful to their days, I think is absolutely valuable. That gives structure and routine and a sense of purpose and identity away from that of being a past prisoner identity. I think having a new clear identity. And mattering, I think we really focus on the importance of individuals feeling as though they matter to us as a service, as individuals, us as clinicians, but to the wider community that they move into, that there's a role and there's an identity and a purpose for the being there, that they make a difference to individuals, and they feel that has definitely supported successful resettlement. I think without that, people sort of start to wobble a bit earlier on than those that feel as though they do matter.
I think another thing we do is we adapt as much as we need to. So as people's needs change, as they progress on their resettlement journey, we're absolutely ready to adapt and to change what we offer depending what their needs are. And I think also sometimes when people come out of prison, there's often a sort of an expectation. For example, I've written lots of parole decisions. Well, this person needs, individual psychological therapy when they're released, and actually they land in the community, and that is the last thing they need. So I think we adapt to what is needed at that moment in an informed way. We do it based on a formulation and based on reflection and team discussions. I think that bit of it is really important. That sort of adapting our approach. And I think the other thing, and Jenny and I are both quite similar, I think, around this, is that we just don't give up. We just keep going. And when something goes wrong, we just keep going. And we'll shift something, or we'll change something, or we'll back off. But we will just keep going and keep going and keep going back to somebody and saying, we're still here if you want services. I know that, you've been recalled and this has all gone wrong and you might be feeling very ashamed, but we're still here. And I think those things feel quite meaningful to me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think one of the really, really interesting things that we've experienced in this journey of working in this service is that the importance of that rupture repair within a relationship, that some of the individuals we work with have never had the repair, so they don't know what that feels like and what it looks like. And sometimes they think once a relationship's ruptured, that's it, that's over. And it's role modeling, it's demonstrating that we don't give up, we're there. And that sometimes takes a long time, just to keep reminding people we're here. And coming out the other end has just been so enormously amazing for the individual and us to see that relationship can build again and be productive and support resettlement, which is amazing.
Just to add to that as well, sorry if this is a really long answer, I think just listening to that, I think one of the things that I think enables us to do that is that we do have a really good reflective team. And I think there are always moments where, often moments where one of us is going, I just can't do this anymore, or this is never going to work, or this person's never going to make it. And there's always somebody else in the team who can go, well, actually, this went really well, and this went. So I do think that teamwork and the different disciplines within the team contributing to seeing a bigger picture or seeing something slightly differently. I think without that, we wouldn't be able to maintain the length of time that we work with people. We wouldn't be able to hold hope, and we wouldn't be able to keep going and be so sort of persistent. It's the sort of team that contains all of that really and enables us to work that way. So I think the way the service is designed and the fact that we're working a really supportive team enables us to keep going with really challenging people, actually, with really challenging traits, who can be difficult to engage and all of those things. But I think the team bit really does make a difference.
It's really useful to hear your perspectives, actually, because I think very often as services, when people are leaving prison, we're very often thinking, oh, these are the outstanding treatment needs and these are what need to be addressed. And actually, we're not very as focused around some of the more practical issues. And I think it's one of the reasons why it's really lovely to have you here today, kind of Jenny, kind of from an occupational kind of lens on this perspectives. I certainly know, I think our work is a lot more rich when we have more of a holistic approach to thinking about people, and actually, you know, as you were saying, Joe, actually what's relevant to them in the community at that time. Like treatment and engaging in psychological therapy is probably not clinically indicated at that point, as they're trying to make that really tricky transition from having left, you know, prison and maybe perhaps being somewhat institutionalized, having served, you know, many years in prison. And how are we setting people perhaps up to fail in some respects by not taking account of some of the things that you've raised? So that's really helpful to think about.
I think one of the things I've learned, and you know, I've been doing this for quite a long time, and I worked in prisons for quite a long time, and I've been in this community role for about 4 years, I think. And one of the things I learned, you know, after quite a long time in this field, was that what we do with people in prison that we think is helping them prepare for release actually does not prepare them for release. So the things that somebody needs to demonstrate to get them through a parole board, I'm not saying they don't have any value, because obviously people need to understand their psychology, they need to understand their risk factors, those things can be really helpful. But quite often the things that people need to convince a parole board that they're safe are not the things they need to enable them to live safely in the community. And I think there is you know, once I started working alongside Jenny and the other occupational therapists, I started to think, why are there not more occupational therapists in prison supporting people at that point of transition and actually identifying this is what these people are going to need? You know, they're not going to need, you know, individual therapy on day one of release. That's just, you know, or reflecting more and talking about, you know, work to reduce the impact of their risk factors is probably going to reduce their risk less than focusing on some of the really practical things that enable somebody to live effectively in the community.
And I think we see that especially sort of the individuals that we work with that have come into prison at a young age, so really 16, 17, and been given very long sentences and coming out of prison, having spent those formative years in an institution that doesn't focus on those practical skill developments. Individuals come out not knowing how to use a washing machine, open a bank account, you know, really, really important things that give them a sense of identity, of who they are. And without that, they feel ashamed, they feel as though they're unskilled and can't navigate. And it's really, really difficult for those individuals to know how to seek help if services aren't around there to identify that before they're released. So we part of the work we do as we reach into prisons prior to release is looking at what their skill level is, what practical support will they need in the first few days, first few weeks, that will enable them to reach the community and feel as though they're not lost and they're not sinking before they can really start to resettle. And often that is those really practical skills that we as occupational therapists can support. And it's sometimes putting that at the front, and other things like the more sort of psychologically driven therapy just being parked for a little bit until they're more settled and able to sit and talk, rather than their head being in a swimming with what do they do next in terms of navigating the community around them.
And I think there's so much obviously changes in the community all the time, and it's I was working with a man who'd been released into the community, and he got onto a bus and the bus was announcing the next stop, and he kept looking and thinking somebody was talking to him, and he got off the bus because he thought, well, I don't know who's talking to me and I don't know who to answer, and he got really confused by that. And it's not a thing you'd naturally automatically tell somebody going out of prison that that's what happens on buses, you know, they announce the next stop. So it's really hard to know how to prepare somebody to go out of prison. I went on a rottle with a man who'd been in prison quite a long time, and we went with him into a bank to open a bank account. So he was only on a day out, and they asked his address, and he said, I'm in prison. And we were in the public area of the bank, and they didn't take him aside or anywhere. They just kept him standing there in the middle of this sort of the bank area while he talked about being in prison. And I thought, you know, that was really unsettling for me. It felt very awkward. You know, so for him it must have been very awkward. And when you're sort of faced with things like that, you're just not prepared for what you're going to say next, and how do I explain where I live, and why I haven't got a bank account at my age, you know, his age. So I think those sorts of things is very hard to prepare for.
And I think as
It is.
psychologists, as you know, we've got lots of skills and lots of strengths, but I don't think that is always one of them. I don't think we always think through, you know, we're sort of worried about the impact of somebody's grievance thinking, but we don't think, well, how they're going to open a bank account, or how they're going to get on the bus, or how they're going to find their way from the hostel to the probation office, how they're going to navigate their way, you know, across a train journey. And that's what I think works so well about having occupational therapists and psychologists working together, is a sort of we cover most bases between us. And the things that I would naturally identify and think, well, they need some support with this, then, you know, the things that Jenny identifies will be different, and they really complement each other. And, you know, I think we do cover like a, you know, a good range of challenges that people will face, just with our different professional perspectives. I think that makes a significant difference, and especially in a community service like this.
Yeah, I think the professions enormously complement each other, because occupational therapists aren't that good at sitting down and talking all the time, but doing the practical elements, but can miss some of the sort of the aspects of that somebody needs to talk through the challenges of that experience. So I think it covers sort of the doing part and the talking part, and us working very closely as a team, making sure that we discuss that, and we work very, very closely. The whole team, every individual has got a named occupational therapist and psychologist. They might not be actively involved, but at least there's a close link who knows the case well, or the individual well, so that we've got a point of contact that we just need to talk about. We can cover that area and think differently. I think that thinking differently is so brilliant, because you can get locked inside your professional sort of thinking box, and thinking outside that is just fantastic. I think that multi-agency, and again with probation, having that sort of psychology, probation and occupational therapy, I think it covers all angles, and probation is so supportive of the work that we do.
And do you have anybody sort of covering the mental health sort of aspects?
I think that's a really good question. I think we don't have anybody in our team who is we don't have any sort of psychiatric time, or sort of psychiatric nurses or anything. And I think we found it quite challenging to access community mental health services for the people that we work with. I think my experience has been, once somebody's got some sort of forensic diagnosis or forensic history, that it can be very difficult for them to access community mental health services. We do have some interface, and we do support people to try and access those services, but that's not something that it's not something that's part of our team, so that we would sort of, you know, be encouraging people to refer on to community mental health teams if somebody had needs in that area.
I think it's been a really interesting and useful learning experience, because occupational therapists are dual trained. We have had clinical psychologists in the team as well. And I think with that, you can easily get drawn into looking at somebody's complex mental illnesses sometimes, or but that's not our remit. And we've had to be really, really almost box-like to say, actually, we can do this, but CMHTs need to do their part for us all to work together for this to work. Everybody's got a really valuable role, rather than thinking that we can do everything, which hasn't worked. It's not helpful for the individual. What has been really helpful is using our clinical knowledge to help navigate individuals be able to access community mental health services in the right way to support their needs. It's not easy, because community mental health services are so stretched, but we have been able to do that more successfully, knowing that if we keep to our remit, what we're asking of them has been really useful.
And one of the things that has been said to me by a few people is that generally people have to go back to the area they came from when they're released, and that can often be the place where the offence happened, and how traumatic for them, although we always think it's, you know, obviously it's traumatic for the victim as well, that if they think that the person's being released, but this could be the first time they've gone back out to the area where it happened, and how traumatic and shocking for them that they didn't expect that to happen. And I don't know if that's something you've done to sort of help prepare people for that.
So I completely agree. We had somebody released recently, not to the place where he committed his offence, but somewhere where he had really painful childhood memories, and could pinpoint, well, that's where this happened, and that's where I had this argument, or And it was really difficult and actually contributed to some challenges for him. So I think that's absolutely right. And I think, you know, everybody's an individual, aren't they? And again, you know, all of our release plans are around, you know, what's right for that person. For some people, we've encouraged them to, we've got 2 probation hostels alongside their probation officer. They've been encouraged perhaps to think about resettling into so to the west of the county rather than the east of the county, to avoid triggers and avoid sort of, you know, painful memories being triggered. And I guess that for some people they've got large exclusion zones, so they're not allowed in the place where they committed their offence. But I think everyone has got really unique needs around that sort of thing. But yes, we've certainly something that's come up. Yeah.
And I think it's not only environmental. I think it's the what prison does. It provides, this is somebody that and a few people that we've been working with. It's a bubble that contains them, that doesn't really get them in a place where they have to think about the consequences of what's happened in life as a result of their offending behaviour. And on release, it really hits them very, very hard, that what they've done, the impact of a particular a community or individuals, and how do they navigate that? How do they come to terms with that? The consequence and the psychological thinking about their offending behaviour that they've never had to address really in prison, because it's been a bubble. So I think it's both the environment, but also the causative, in a way, not causative, but sort of the environment of the prison and what release means.
I think what we've learned, or what I've learned, is that the community has so many emotional triggers for people, and that sometimes is geography specific, but sometimes it really isn't. Sometimes it's somebody asking them a difficult question in the bank, or somebody looking at them funny when they say they come from the hostel, or, you know, feeling that somebody's looked their name up on Google and then is judging them or treating them differently. So I think the experience of being in the community, whatever sort of geographical location that is, after so many years in prison, is just emotionally really, really challenging. Like, it triggers all sorts of things that people aren't expecting. And often people say things like, well, all the things I thought would be really difficult are actually okay. You know, I can manage this, I can manage that, I worked out how to use the contactless card, whatever. But the things that floor them are totally unexpected, because they weren't expecting to feel like this, like all of these feelings that are just triggered without any sort of warning. Because I guess prison, you know, whilst in itself prison can be traumatizing, it's also pretty predictable. Like, the same sorts of things happen at the same sorts of times, the same, like the noises and the smells and the experiences are pretty limited, really. Whereas in the community, that's not true at all. Like, you're just bombarded with stuff. And I think that's my experience, is what's been really challenging for people, just this emotional and sort of psychological and sensory overload that they just weren't prepared for. And no amount of talking beforehand necessarily prepares people for that. Just the feelings are so overwhelming. So a lot of our work early on is about, this is normal, it's okay to feel like that, you know, people often feel like this, let's just take some breaths, let's just sort of stand and breathe the air and see what's around us. So I think that experience, do you agree with that?
Yeah. And it's the experience, and also not knowing how to navigate it. So I think technology has been such a massive challenge for particularly individuals that's been in custody a long time and are slightly older, and they come out and they're supposed to know how to use a phone, and then there's all these apps on the phone that ping, and they feel as though they should respond to, and it keeps them up until really early hours of the morning, because they think that they should respond to all these things, and then they don't get a good sleep hygiene, and therefore they can't regulate their emotions at times of particular stress. So I think it's feeling overwhelmed and then not knowing how to navigate what the things that are overwhelming them.
And people have spoken to me about waiting in their room in the morning for it to be unlocked, you know, after having 10, 15 years of that happening at 8 o'clock every morning, that they don't even think they can go out the door. You know, it's surprising, those sorts of things that we probably don't think about.
Yes.
that they really get, you're still years later expecting that to happen.
Absolutely. I think another thing I've noticed recently, it sort of occurred to me recently, is how poor people are when they come out of prison at managing time. They just have never had to do that for years. Somebody tells them when their dinner's ready, or, you know, when it's dinner time, they tell them what time to get up, they tell them when they should be going to work. So we might say to somebody, oh, you've got an appointment at 11:30. Okay, yeah, no, I know I've got an appointment at 11:30, but they'll find themselves at 11 o'clock, like 2 hours away, without any awareness of how long it takes them to get back for 11:30. And we've seen lots of people sort of trip up because they just have no awareness of time. And I think that's the same thing when you're so used to being in an environment where those decisions are made for you and you've got no need to manage any of those things or even be aware of those things for yourself. That's quite a little thing, seemingly a little thing, but actually can really mess up somebody's day. And then that sort of has an emotional impact, and people feeling rubbish about, like, I can't even get to an appointment on time. What sort of person am I? You know, I can't even manage my day. You know, they must think I'm an idiot. And before you know it, that sort of can spiral somebody into a state of feeling ashamed and hopeless, and I'm never going to manage this community living thing. So I think the time and being able to organize themselves, that's been a bit of a, yes, that's been a challenge for people. I think that is a challenge for people.
And it's really interesting that, because I was thinking, actually, I wondered also services then might fall into the trap. Well, actually, they're just not compliant.
Yes, exactly.
With services because they can't manage their time, and actually it's a skill.
It's a skill,
it is a real skill to manage your time. I think, I think I struggle with it sometimes, even, in my own, work, sometimes it is a real skill to kind of learn and develop. And when you're used to having a certain routine and, being told where to go, or, being unlocked to go to healthcare, or, and then all of a sudden you have to manage it by yourself. I think it would be easy for services to kind of fall into that, to say, well, actually, they're just not compliant because they haven't been able to get here. They're 2 hours late.
Yeah, and also a question where they've got some sort of cognitive impairment that they keep forgetting and they can't remember basic information, and you realise over time that actually that they're just so overwhelmed that they can't absorb any more information. And it's working out strategies like timetables and reminders on phones to support them remembering. And we've had to work really closely with individuals to find the things that work for them. Some are pocket diaries, some are phones, some are big timetables on their wall. Everybody's unique, but just knowing those sort of things that really can dysregulate people, but can also really help frame a day is really, really valuable.
There's another thing people have really struggled with. They've rung me from when they've been released to say, I'm just got nothing to do. I've got nothing. I've had my meeting with my probation officer. That's my one thing today. And then I've literally got nothing to do for the rest of the day. And how difficult that can be to fill your day.
I think it links in really well with what Jenny was saying earlier about, having a role, having a purpose, how that feeds into your identity. And, actually within prison, there's a certain routine, a structure, but they know where to go. They know they might be on association, or they might have a job, or they go to education, or they've got an appointment with a service. So, there is that. But if they've nothing else around that in the community, that could be quite challenging, I imagine.
And it's really difficult when people particularly come out of prison, because they often come out of prison because they've done quite well in prison, and so they've had stable jobs, they've engaged well with people, they've been stable, and they come out and there literally is nothing initially. That there's only appointments to attend, and that's it. They've got no sense of using any skills at all. So what we do try is for individuals where we know that's really, really important, and it's not important for everybody, but for individuals where it is important, is to have some structure, some volunteering, some work opportunities, some educational aspects set up prior to release. So on release, they've got an idea about when they'll start that and how it will look.
I think just sort of leading on from that, and I think Jenny's touched on this already, but I guess another thing to say about that sort of prison community transition thing is how people have to learn to cope and survive in prison, and the skills you need to cope and survive in prison are very different to the skills you need to cope and survive in the community. And people talk to us in the community about, well, I don't know how to get my needs met without shouting, because in prison, if you don't shout and get your voice heard, then someone's nicking your telly. One day they're nicking your tea, then they're nicking your telly, and then they're nicking, before you know it, you're a victim and you're being bullied. So actually, for people who've spent a long time in prison, their prison identity is so well established. And often people have, like Jenny has said, have done very well in prison, and partly because they found this way to cope and found this way to manage, they find themselves in the community, and all of the things that they know and all of the ways in which they know how to deal with problems and know how to get their needs met are counterproductive. They actually are ineffective. So helping people to unpick that, and especially when you sort of think the prison identity is often laid upon years of trauma, and people have spent years finding ways of coping with this sort of traumatic experiences, often by becoming aggressive and violent and stuff. And suddenly we're asking people to behave very differently, and they just don't know how to do that. That's not part of their identity. So helping people to find out, a number of people have said to us, I just don't know who I am. Like, how do you find people when they're in their 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s to find themselves and to work out who they are and who they want to be and how they want to go about solving their problems and dealing with their day and engaging with people in the community? It's a massive task. And again, I think, my time working in prisons, I don't think I ever fully appreciated quite what a massive task that is for someone to make that transition into the community.
Mm. So I believe you've got a book coming out about this very subject.
Absolutely.
And we worked together on it because I was in a similar position of thinking of men coming from closed to open prison, and how synchronicity happened. You were thinking of writing a book about people moving from closed prison, open prison to the community. And so it's really brought into the forefront for me a lot about transitions from different places for staff and residents, from moving from one place to another. And lots of what you're saying really rings true for people going from closed prison to open prison as well. So could you tell us a bit more about the book that you've written and what sort of things feature in it?
And the focus is on supporting men transitioning from prison to the community. And the reason why it's focused on men is because that's the larger number of people on our caseload. We really don't get many women on our within our service. So we're more familiar with working with men within this particular remit, and the challenges that they face. And we wanted it to be a book that was almost co-written by the people with lived experience, and that's a larger portion of people that we work with, so we could get a larger voice heard. That was really our one of our main remits, is that this had to incorporate the lived experience voice to enable their voice to be heard amongst that of professionals. We were really, really lucky to work with some amazing clinicians who felt equally passionate about this. So Joe and I have edited the book. We've written some chapters within the book, but we've also invited other individuals to contribute, including yourself, Jerry, and some other brilliant people that have really held the ethos that we had, the vision that we had of incorporating both a clinical perspective, but those of lived experience within each chapter. So there's a pattern throughout the book of that lived experience voice, as well as the clinical voice, as well as backed up by evidence from various sources of literature. And it incorporates lots of elements of a person's journey from what it feels like to move from closed to open prisons, and then following that out into the community, and then the different aspects that individuals might experience in that journey. But also the main focus is that collaborative working between occupational therapy and psychology. I think Joe and I have really, really embrace that relationship. We see the benefits, we feel the benefits every day, and we hear the benefits from the people we work with of how that works. And we wanted to really bring to light that really valuable relationship of not one profession working on their own, but that collaborative working between occupational therapy, psychology, and the offender management aspect of it as well.
I think one of the things we really wanted to do was really share our experiences of the challenges that people experience when they're first released, or when they are on that journey from prison into the community. Because I guess we spent a lot of time thinking about what was difficult for people, and we saw patterns in the difficulties people experience. I think we've talked about some of them today, like things like the sense of being emotionally overwhelmed, the sense of their sort of sensory world just being this explosion of things that are sort of overwhelming, the issues around identity and forming a new identity, how challenging those first few days and weeks are, the practical issues we've talked about and how people actually navigate those. We wanted to pay attention to things like relationships and working, how you build relationships with people at this particular time of transition. It's a specifically challenging time, and how we use our therapeutic and professional relationships to support people, as well as sort of highlight some specific areas that are challenging, like some around substances, around trauma, around working with people with sexual convictions that for whom resettlement is particularly challenging. I guess we just had spent so much time thinking and talking about those things, and we'd heard so many stories of people's challenge and people's people tripping up and being recalled and then supporting them through a recall. We just wanted to share our experiences. We wanted to share our sort of clinical experience, but also wanted to share, like Jenny said, the stories of people who've been through the transition and what they've learned about what they need. So I guess we were talking about these things a lot, and we sort of thought, how are we going to share all this stuff? And I guess it sort of came out of that, really, wanting to share our experiences of, the unique sort of stage of somebody's life of moving from prison to the community, and how we can maximize their chances of success, really.
We really wanted to hear the voices of those with lived experience, but we didn't know whether they'd want to contribute. And so we gently sort of talked about our ideas and what we were thinking. And the amount of interest we had in this, we had individuals offer to co-write chapters with us. We had individuals want to be named in the book as individuals contributing because they wanted their voice heard so much. It was a really lovely experience of people wanting their voice heard and feeling very pleased to be able to be asked to be asked to contribute. And we've got a brilliant afterword by somebody who has been through the system, been through services, and come out and no longer has any contact with services at all, but keeps in touch with us just to sort of let us know how they're doing. And I think it felt a very, very positive experience from not knowing how we lay in asking or introducing the idea to the people that we wanted to hear their voices, to hearing their feedback was really, really wonderful. The contributions, and very generous, the contributions that made towards this. I think people have been really, really wonderful with this.
It's absolutely fascinating. I just wondered, from what you've kind of learned through writing the book, would you have a top 5 key things for services who are trying to support people, so services in prison who are trying to support people transition to the community where they don't have an IIRMS service like yourselves? So what would be kind of your top 5 kind of key things you would recommend for people to be thinking about to help people transition?
I think normalise the experience of how difficult it's going to be, or enable people to feel that if they struggle, then that's okay and that's normal. And the experience of transitioning into the community is very challenging. And if it feels overwhelming, then that's normal, and they can be supported through that. And I think that feels really important. That sort of how difficult the first few days and weeks are, and normalizing that so people don't feel that they're a failure immediately because they're struggling. And I think supportive relationships, professional relationships, are central to all of this, really, and working with people as individuals, that sort of human to human thing, connecting with people in a human way and supporting them, and sort of on an individual basis. That I would say they are probably 2 of my top 5.
I think, from my perspective, having a plan of what the first few days, first few weeks is going to look like, that's realistic. It's not just written by the person about to be released, it is written with somebody else that will support them in looking at realistically what they can achieve at certain points within the first few days, few weeks, which will encourage them to slow down, not race through everything, because I think it's the racing that is particularly tricky. And having some point of contact that will make them feel as though they are somebody in the community. So whether that's a voluntary organisation, whether it's a professional, whether it's a member of the family, just somebody that will make them feel as though they've arrived in the community, they're noticed, they're somebody, is really important.
I mean, I don't know. I sort of think that we can underestimate the power of the little things. You remember that sort of prison service strapline some years ago about every contact matters? And, you know, I'm not a big fan of straplines, but every contact really does matter. And, you know, the tiniest things can make the difference between success and failure. And again, you know, just an example, remember somebody being released not so long ago, turning up at the hostel and just not feeling welcomed. So rather than, oh, you know, hi, it's really nice to meet you, just like, oh, you've got a lot of stuff. And that seems nothing in the great scheme of everything that's going on for somebody. That seems like nothing, but actually those little, every time we meet with somebody, we have an opportunity to make them feel like they matter and that they're important and that we're a human being or not. And I think taking those opportunities and really showing to people that we see whatever they've done, wherever they've been, whatever their journey is, we see their humanity, and we will speak to that and we will work with that, even when that's really difficult. I sort of think that I feel like I think about everything I say and everything I do, and that feels quite important, that we think and reflect all the time about the impact we're having on people, and, you know, making sure we keep their humanity at the centre of that.
And what's the book called?
It's called The Journey from Prison to Community, Finding Identity, Meaning and Belonging with Men in the UK.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for attending today. It's been really interesting to hear about your service and thinking about the different places we are all working on in the OPD service. We're all just different parts along the chain of that service. So it's really nice to hear about hopefully the most positive end, when people are getting out of prison and resettling into the community. So really appreciate you both giving up your time and look forward to seeing the book. And that just remains for me to say, let's talk forensic psychology.